Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take on the ideas that matter. Today, we're venturing into some pretty challenging territory. We're talking about the idea of abolishing not just prisons, but maybe our current mental health care systems as well. Now, that might sound radical, I know, but we've got a stack of really fascinating sources here that make a powerful case, and we want to unpack it all for you.
That's right. And when we use that word abolition here, we're not talking about just, tweaking the system around the edges. We're really diving deep into arguments for a fundamental shift, a whole different way of thinking about and responding to mental distress and what gets called mental illness. It's about building on a completely different foundation, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help us understand this perspective, we've been digging through some pretty significant documents. We have this CMHN Abolition Perspectives Report, which lays out a lot of the core arguments. And then there's the Shining a Light report, which really focuses on the impact of coercive practices. Plus the big one, not before time state acknowledgement of harm, looking at, well, the historical and ongoing harm.
Yeah, that was crucial.
And a few other shorter pieces, too, for context.
So our goal with this deep dive is to really get under the skin of the reasoning behind this call to abolish current mental health laws. We want to explore, what are the main arguments, what alternatives, like community-led things are already out there or being suggested, and really just bring this perspective into the light because it's often not part of the mainstream conversation, but it holds, well, a lot of weight for people with lived experience.
Okay, so let's jump right in. What's the absolute core argument we keep seeing in these sources for abolition in mental health?
Well, across all the material, the really strong message, the one that comes through loud and clear, is that many people who've actually been through the system, plus their advocates, they believe the current laws aren't just flawed. They see them as morally unjust. Full stop. They argue these laws cause significant harm, not just physical, but deep mental, emotional harm. And they really undermine a person's agency, their ability to make their own choices.
That's a really powerful claim. What makes the laws feel so harmful, so unjust in their view?
A key point that keeps coming up is this idea that the laws are fundamentally discriminatory. They single out people who've been given a label mentally ill, and this is crucial. They override the basic principle of consent, the consent we take for granted in pretty much all other healthcare.
Right, like you wouldn't be forced into surgery for a broken leg if you refuse.
Exactly. But that kind of forced treatment happens routinely in mental health. The sources really hammer home this double standard, this denial of legal rights based purely on a medical interpretation of someone's distress.
And it's not just about that individual choice, is it? The sources mention international human rights standards, too.
Oh, absolutely. The World Health Organization, the UN, especially the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, you hear it called, that's central here. From that perspective, many coercive practices in mental health directly clash with international human rights law. They can violate the right to be treated as equal before the law, the right to liberty, security, and, crucially, the right to give informed consent to treatment.
So if these laws are seen as actually violating human rights, what's the vision for replacing them? What's the alternative?
The abolitionist view is we need to move away from these laws entirely, just get rid of them,
Right.
and build a system based on what's called full supported decision-making.
Supported decision-making.
Okay. Now, we have to be realistic. No country has fully implemented the CRPD's vision here yet. It's aspirational in many ways, but the sources argue this is the direction we should be heading. And big part of this is shifting resources, taking money out of coercive institutional settings and putting it into community-led initiatives, things like peer-run crisis support, safe houses, places people can go that don't involve force.
Okay, but you often hear the argument, don't you, that we can't possibly get rid of the current system until we have really solid alternatives ready to go. How do abolition advocates respond to that?
Yeah, that's a very common pushback. The sources tackle it head on. They basically say that alternatives need to come first is kind of a stalling tactic. They point out that consent-based community initiatives, they aren't just a dream for the future. They already exist. Lots of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe they're small, maybe they're under-resourced, but they're out there. So the argument is, if we change our basic approach, if we shift the funding away from coercion, these existing things can grow and new ones can pop up.
So it's not about waiting for perfection, but enabling what's already starting.
Exactly, enabling and investing.
One of the things that really struck me in the material was this connection they draw between mental health systems and the prison system. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, this is a really a really important and growing perspective, especially among disability activists and people who identify as consumer or psychiatric survivors. They argue that psychiatry, well, in its current form, operates as part of a much bigger system of control, what they call the carceral system.
Carceral system, so wider than just prisons.
Much wider. They see psychiatry as sharing features, even historical roots, with the prison industrial complex, the PIC, and also the medical industrial complex, the MIC. It's about looking at all the ways society controls and manages groups seen as different or difficult.
Okay. What kind of specific similarities do they point to between, say, psychiatric hospitals and prisons?
Well, the parallels listed are pretty stark, actually. Things like police being the first responders to mental health crises, the use of solitary confinement seclusion rooms and physical restraints in both, limited access to basic things like sunlight, fresh air, communication with the outside world.
Wow.
Alarmingly high rates of sexual violence reported in both settings. Very few real ways for people to appeal decisions or complain about rights violations. And crucially, both systems disproportionately impact marginalized groups, BIPOC individuals, trans and gender nonconforming people, people with histories of trauma.
That's quite an indictment.
It is. And one source specifically quotes the U.S. author Jenny Logan, saying, any real abolition movement has to include dismantling things like community treatment orders and involuntary hospitalization, seeing them as part of that same controlling system.
It really throws the spotlight onto coercion, doesn't it? How is coercion actually defined in this context? Because it sounds like it's more than just physical force.
That's right. It's understood really broadly. It covers overt threats, obviously, but also any kind of pressure or compulsion that makes someone do something against their will. It's fundamentally about taking away their agency, their choice.
And the sources detail the different forms this can take.
Exactly. There's being detained and treated in hospital against your will, obviously, but also community treatment orders, CTOs, which can force people living in the community to take medication, have injections, even have ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, without consent.
Right.
And then within hospitals, you have seclusion, being locked alone, and various restraints, physical holds, mechanical restraints like straps, or chemical restraint using medication.
But the material also mentioned something called emotional or psychological restraint.
Yeah.
That was a new term for me in this context.
It's a really important concept to grasp. It's more subtle, yeah. It happens when someone learns, maybe the hard way, that expressing their real views or feelings, especially if they challenge the staff or the treatment plan, will lead to negative consequences.
Like what?
Like having privileges withdrawn, being rewarded for being compliant, and punished, maybe subtly, for disagreeing, or even just the threat of being put in seclusion or having their voluntary status changed to involuntary. One report gives this really chilling example. Someone's told they're voluntary, but if they actually try to leave, they're threatened with being sectioned.
So even without physical force, they feel trapped.
Precisely. They feel they have no real choice, no real voice. It creates this environment of deep disempowerment.
And what are the wider consequences of using these coercive practices, according to the sources?
Well, they're seen as direct violations of human rights laws, both domestic and international, like the CRPD we mentioned. They also cause significant moral injury and distress for the staff involved, believe it or not.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it undermines ethical standards, leads to poor organizational cultures, cultures of control rather than care. And ultimately, the abolitionist perspective is that these practices are simply not necessary. They can be eliminated by shifting to recovery-oriented, rights-based care.
This feeling of being treated as less than human seems to be a recurring theme. The idea of dehumanization, loss of autonomy.
Yes, absolutely. Many people describe their experiences with mental health services as deeply dehumanizing, feeling treated like an object, not a person. Especially when their distress gets labeled as irrational or they're deemed incompetent to make decisions about their own life and body. It just strips away their sense of self.
And there was that point about psychiatric diagnosis itself potentially playing a role in this.
Yeah.
Something about requiring a confession.
Right, that was Minkowicz's observation. The idea that the system often pushes people to accept this confession of being mentally ill, to adopt a self-identity based on deficits, on what's supposedly wrong with them.
Which undermines their own sense of strength or self-determination.
Exactly. It works against seeing their own resources or finding their own meaning in their experiences. And this connects directly to this concept of cognitive liberty, which is really key for many activists.
Cognitive liberty. Define that for us.
It's basically the right to control your own consciousness, to be free from unwanted, mind-altering interventions, to experience all your thoughts and feelings without punishment or coercion as long as you're not harming others. It's about mental self-determination.
The sources don't shy away from some very strong language,
Hmm.
even using the word torture in relation to some psychiatric interventions. That feels like a really significant claim.
It is a significant claim, and it's not made lightly. The sources reference a 2020 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. That report explicitly stated that involuntary psychiatric interventions can, in certain circumstances, amount to torture.
How so?
The argument is that forced treatment often involves discriminatory and coercive attempts to basically control someone's personality or behavior, and that this can inflict severe pain and suffering, mental and psychological suffering, by attacking basic human needs for autonomy, dignity, security.
The idea of a torturous environment within psychiatric settings was also discussed. What does that mean in practice?
It describes environments where people feel utterly powerless, little or no control over their day, profound helplessness. This can be intensified by things like the arbitrary giving or taking away of basic comforts or needs, rules that seem absurd or contradictory, being forced to participate in treatments you feel are harming you.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
Beyond stressful. The sources also mention the humiliation, the lack of privacy from constant surveillance, the deep sense of betrayal when a placement for help becomes a source of fear.
Which brings us to those really upsetting terms: sanctuary harm and sanctuary trauma. Can you explain those?
Right. So many people entering mental health services already have trauma histories, right? Practices like being locked in seclusion, being physically restrained, forced medication, involuntary detention. These can be intensely frightening and humiliating. They can mirror past traumas.
So sanctuary harm is harm happening in a place that should be safe.
Exactly. And sanctuary trauma is the re-traumatization that results from those experiences. And there's research cited in the reports linking these experiences to, sadly, longer hospital stays and even a higher chance of being secluded or restrained again in the future. It can become this awful cycle.
It's clear this abolitionist perspective isn't just about tearing things down, though. It seems equally focused on building something different.
Oh, absolutely. Abolition in this context isn't about neglect or just walking away. It's about actively dismantling systems seen as oppressive, yes, but also actively building community-based systems of support, accountability, and care. It starts from a belief in everyone's shared capacity for both harm and transformation.
And rejecting certain authority.
Yes, rejecting psychiatry's claim to hold the sole truth about distress, rejecting its authority to define normal, and crucially rejecting its power to impose treatments without consent. The focus shifts towards things like cognitive liberty, like we discussed, and even delighting in neurodiversity, seeing different ways of thinking and being as valuable.
And this leads naturally to the call for deinstitutionalization, which people might have heard of, but the sources seem to push it further, even talking about things like reparations.
Yeah, they do. The UN CRPD guidelines talk about ending detention based on disability and ensuring proper support when people leave institutions, housing, income, community connection to avoid just shifting the problem. But some thinkers, like Valencia mentioned in one source, propose even more radical steps,
That's why.
like dismantling psychiatric diagnoses altogether, recognizing alternative identities like being a voice hearer or autistic, or having multiple selves as valid ways of being, moving completely from compliance to consent, allowing people to leave facilities whenever they want, and, importantly, decoupling financial support from mental health gatekeepers. So your income support isn't dependent on engaging with this system.
That sounds like a huge shift.
It is. It connects strongly to the principles of disability justice, which really centers the experiences of disabled people who face multiple forms of marginalization. Disability justice aims to dismantle ableism and all related oppressions, working towards a world where every kind of body and mind is seen as valuable and beautiful. And they also talk about restorative and transformative justice, non-punitive ways to address harm, focusing on healing, accountability, and tackling the root causes of why harm happens.
It felt really important that the sources emphasized the leadership role of First Nations communities in this whole conversation.
Absolutely critical. The reports stress that First Nations activism and resistance is abolitionist leadership, historically and today. It's often just not framed that way.
Can you give an example?
Well, the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service is highlighted. It was established through community advocacy, and its model focuses on holistic well-being, cultural connection, community strength, not just a narrow medical view. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is mentioned as a powerful, long-standing symbol of self-determination and sovereignty. Essentially, the ongoing struggle by First Nations people for their rights, their land, their well-being, that is, resistance to imposed systems, including those based on ideas of white superiority.
And it's encouraging to see concrete examples of community-led alternatives already happening. It's not just theory.
No, definitely not. And the reports list quite a few, showing the diversity of what's possible. You have things like the LA County Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative, focusing on non-police crisis response teams, harm reduction.
By taking police out of the equation for mental health calls.
Exactly. And peer-staffed first responder teams are another model being explored. Then there's something called healing justice training, which sounds fascinating. It reframes mental health support as a liberatory practice.
Liberatory. How so?
By using consent-based approaches, drawing on ancestral wisdom, informal care networks. It mentions practices like being present with someone, connecting with nature, chanting, creating refuge spaces, mutual aid, political literacy involving elders. It's a much broader, more holistic view of support. And one of the reports, the CMHN one, has this great appendix just listing community-led services.
Oh, wow. Can you give us a flavor of what's in there?
Sure. It's a real mix. There's a FIA House in Massachusetts, a non-clinical home-like alternative to hospital. Project LES in the U.S. does direct support, advocacy, resource sharing. The National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery promotes person-driven recovery.
Things we might have heard of, maybe?
Some, yeah. The Hearing Voices Network is quite well known supporting people who hear voices in a positive way. MAD in America, which critiques and aims to rethink psychiatric care. Then there are things like Mind Freedom Shield for mutual support against coerced psychiatry, an abolition-centered care provider database in the U.S. called Blackline, offering peer support with an LGBTQ+ Black femme lens. Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, their mobile crisis teams with a medic and crisis worker are often cited.
So very practical, on-the-ground initiatives.
Definitely. Cambridge Heart, working towards a carceral-free city. Depressed While Black for specific community support. Mental Health First Oakland, another non-police response. Peer support space in Australia. Trans Lifeline for trans people. There's even a place in Berlin, Vegloff Haus Villa Stuckel, an anti-psychiatric runaway house controlled by users.
Wow, run by users themselves.
Yeah. Wisconsin Milkweed Alliance promoting choice and healing, Yarrow Collective in Colorado doing peer support, the Personal Ombudsman Service in Sweden as supported decision-making, Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service in the UK. It's a long list, showing that alternatives do exist and take many forms.
And the reports also included direct interviews with activists and advocates. What were the key messages coming from them?
Those interviews really bring the arguments to life. Some key themes were this deep conviction that current mental health laws are just fundamentally wrong. They violate human rights. They're discriminatory based on what they see as pseudoscience.
A strong rejection of the legal basis.
Very strong. A call for one law for everyone, not special laws just for people with psychiatric labels. Also, the idea that the laws themselves can make things worse, can trap people in a patient position, and contribute to their distress.
That's a challenging thought.
It is. They also talked about the moral injury for peer workers, people with lived experience working in the system who witness rights violations that then get covered up, concerns about cultural safety being ignored because of perceived risk, and this strong sense of the interconnectedness of it all, legal system, medical system, police, all working together as forms of social control.
So, given all these deep critiques, what kind of alternative laws or policies are actually being proposed by abolition advocates? If they want repeal, what comes next?
Well, the strongest call, as we said, is just repeal. With that argument, you don't need a good alternative to stop doing something bad. Just stop the harm first.
Okay, but beyond that?
Beyond that, the focus is on developing human rights-informed policies. Laws built on non-coercion, on supported decision-making, on autonomy. The Trieste experience in Italy comes up again and again as a kind of beacon.
Remind us what happened there.
They essentially closed their large psychiatric hospitals decades ago, repealed the laws allowing long-term forced treatment, and invested massively in community-based, open-door services. And apparently they have very low rates of involuntary treatment now.
So it can be done.
That's the argument. Another example mentioned is from Heidenheim, Germany, where they consciously worked to reduce detention and forced medication and found it got easier over time as alternatives developed. There's a huge emphasis on demedicalizing distress, ensuring people can access practical support housing, income, social connection, and psychosocial support grounded in communities using informal networks.
So less focus on clinical intervention, more on life support.
Exactly. Building community. Someone even mentioned picnics and barbecues as examples of simple community building. Strengthening sustainable social services. Creating plans with individuals that meet their needs. Peer responder models are huge. And needing additional funding for community responses, not just diverting existing
Right, not
funds.
just shuffling the deck chairs.
Precisely. It's about seeing distress not just as an individual failing, but as a crisis in the ecosystem, meaning we need to fix the systemic issues. Poverty, discrimination, isolation that limit people's lives. They mentioned psychosocial services in India using counseling, arts-based therapy, Eastern healing techniques focusing on sensory and body work. And here, the Victorian Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organization specifically calls for investing in consumer survivor-led crisis support and trying out peer first responder programs.
This leads us inevitably to the need for accountability, for acknowledging the harms that have happened. That not before time report seems crucial here.
It really is. It focuses directly on the state's responsibility to acknowledge the harm caused by the mental health system over decades. It talks about the historical context, like racist assessment techniques used against First Peoples, leading directly to ongoing disparities, like Aboriginal people still being secluded and restrained at higher rates today.
So a direct line from past injustice to present harm.
Yes. It also highlights how families, carers, supporters, their expertise, their needs have been ignored, how biomedical models often just don't fit or are even harmful for First Peoples collectivist views of well-being. It talks about people feeling abandoned or neglected when they seek help because of underfunding or just poor service design.
And the lack of justice within the system.
Huge point. Unlawful practice and the denial of justice. Lack of transparency, lack of accountability when things go wrong, when rights are breached. It details the trauma for families, too, witnessing violence or coercion, sometimes feeling forced into collaborating with practices that violate their loved ones' rights.
Just unimaginable stress.
And the sheer scale of loss for consumers and survivors. Loss of life, loss of relationships, homes, jobs, futures. It also points fingers at the failures of interconnected systems, family violence services, child protection, housing, how discrimination based on a mental health diagnosis makes everything worse. And it calls out the exploitative reliance on unpaid carers, a direct result of closing institutions without properly funding community support.
So, in response to all this documented harm, the concept of reparations comes up. What does that entail in this context?
It's presented as a necessary step towards healing and justice. Reparations here could include several things: formal political apologies, truth and reconciliation processes where stories can be told and harms acknowledged publicly, material reparations that could mean compensation for individuals, but also collective reparations like funding for community-led healing programs or services.
Things beyond individual payouts.
Exactly. Symbolic reparations too, like memorials or public education campaigns. And critically, guarantees of non-repetition. Guarantees that this won't happen again.
Have there been any apologies already?
The report mentions apologies from the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, though notes criticism about lack of survivor consultation, and a stronger one from the American Psychological Association, grappling with its history of racism. But truth and reconciliation processes, like the one in New Zealand for former psychiatric hospital patients, are seen as really vital for dealing with widespread harm and restoring dignity.
And those guarantees of non-repetition seem key.
Absolutely. The report stresses that these guarantees must involve real structural and legislative change, including, from the perspective of many advocates, abolishing the laws that permit compulsory treatment in the first place. The Not Before Time report itself draws on ideas like restorative justice, First People's wisdom, transitional justice, MAD studies, human rights, a whole framework.
A comprehensive approach.
Yeah. It recommends a formal restorative justice process led by commissioners with lived experience. It calls for collective reparations, separate from regular service funding, and it constantly circles back to those guarantees of non-repetition through systemic change. Ultimately, it's about acknowledging the profound, deep pain carried by consumers, survivors, families, and carers.
Of course, while digging deep into this abolitionist perspective, it's important we briefly acknowledge counter-arguments.
Yes, and the sources do touch on this briefly. They acknowledge the view that, for some people, hospital admission and treatment, even if involuntary initially, can be life-saving, that it can be essential in preventing suicide or helping someone towards recovery, understanding recovery not necessarily as a cure, but as finding a way to live a meaningful life.
So acknowledging that potential benefit for some.
Yes, while also noting the abolitionist counterpoint that many people who are involuntarily detained do not later feel it was helpful or justified. It's not a universally positive experience, even in retrospect.
And it was interesting to see the idea of reparations also being explored for other groups harmed in institutions, like people living with dementia.
Yes, that was a brief but important connection made, drawing parallels in experiences of stigma, ableism, ageism, being segregated, detained, restrained. Sadly, similar patterns of harm exist. They mention specific dementia reparations principles developed through research with people with dementia, carers,
What
advocates.
was key there?
A major point was the need for recognition. People living with dementia are often devalued, not believed, their experiences dismissed as just symptoms. So recognition is about affirming their value, their personhood, their human rights before anything else.
Okay, this has been an incredibly rich and, frankly, challenging deep dive into a perspective that really pushes us to rethink things. Just to summarize the core arguments for abolition again.
Sure. In essence, current mental health laws are seen as causing significant harm and being inherently discriminatory. Viable, often more humane, community-led alternatives already exist and need investment. And these mental health systems are viewed as deeply intertwined with broader systems of social control and incarceration, like the prison system.
Then the call is for.
A fundamental shift away from coercion towards supported decision-making, a massive reinvestment in community initiatives that prioritize consent and autonomy, and a serious commitment to addressing past and present harms through things like restorative justice and meaningful reparations.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Considering everything we've explored today, the arguments about harm, discrimination, the potential of community alternatives, the calls for accountability, what fundamental shifts in our own understanding of mental health, of crisis, of societal support might be necessary to truly uphold the dignity and rights of every single individual. Something to reflect on. We hope this deep dive has given you plenty to think about and maybe encourage you to explore some of the resources we touched on.